Hello, everyone, and welcome to our EdTech Team Online Teacher Leader Chat. This is our final Hangout for the June Teacher Leader cohorts. And first of all, we just want to say congratulations to everyone for completing all those 6 courses and for all of your hard work over the last 12 weeks. We're really excited for our Hangout today. Remember that if you have questions during the Hangout, that you can tweet them out using the EdTech Team Online hashtag. You can also just put them in the sidebar of the YouTube Live event. And Dominique will be monitoring the back channel. She's here with us as well. And so if you have any questions, she will pass them on. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you guys to Mark Wagner, the CEO of the EdTech Team and the author of the most recent release from EdTech Team Press, More Now. And so he's going to join us and share a little bit about what it means to be a teacher leader and about school change and about his new book. So welcome, Mark. Do you want to tell us anything else about yourself to start?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm a former high school English teacher, and I've been a tech coordinator at the site, district, and county level. But I think it's safe to say that I was a teacher leader. I didn't actually go the admin route. As a tech coordinator at the high school, it was certainly on a teacher's contract, and same thing at the district I worked at. Once I moved on to the county, then it was all weird. But actually set up EdTech Team 12 years ago in June. So I know it's been a while, and we as some of you know, we started doing summits 6 years ago. The first summit was July 2012. But what you guys have asked me to come in and talk about today is actually perfect for this cohort and the teacher leader program in general, because the book is organized around the same framework as the certification. So you guys would be familiar with the honeycomb arrangement, and the 6 elements that we dive into in depth in this program are the same that are in the book. I don't think that the picture comes across great by a Hangout, but the book is organized in sections focused on courageous leadership, on empowered teachers, on inspiring spaces, engaged community, robust infrastructure, and of course, student agency, which really maybe should be at the center of the model, visually speaking, right? So I can give a little bit of an overview of where the book takes those topics and how we pulled that together, and then if there's questions coming in from the back channel at all, happy to dive into those and maybe leave you guys with some questions of my own.
That would be fantastic.
So the other thing I should probably start with is the book's title may require a little bit of explanation. So it sort of has 2 titles. The big one is More Now, and the subtitle is A Message from the Future for the Educators of Today. And the More Now really comes from the idea that, well, there's a funny story behind it too, but the overarching idea is, as educators, we often tend to be stuck in the past, right? We're teaching about the past. We're doing things the way they've always been done. We were probably successful in the traditional education systems ourselves, and we're sort of perpetuating that model. But as education technologists, right, as geeky educators, we're often stuck in the future and focused on what could be or what should be, and that's not any more of a productive place to be. And the book is very much about what's possible now. And so the title, of course, is alluding to less tomorrow, less yesterday, and more now. The funny story behind it, of course, is I end most of my emails with the phrase "more soon," and initially it was a guilty thing for me. Like, I've sent you some information. I know it's not everything that I owe you, but more soon, right? And that just turned out to apply to almost all my emails. But when Jenny Magara was originally getting emails from me, she felt guilty because she thought I wanted her to get back to me soon, like get back to me quickly, not just quickly, but more quickly. So we had some good laughs about that when we figured that out. And then when we hired her, just over a year ago, her 2-word email to me was more now. So it was, and then we started looking at like, oh wow, there's a lot to that philosophy. It's, less yesterday, less tomorrow, less worrying, right? So that's where the title of the book comes from, and the subtitle is A Message from the Future for the Educators of Today. And the idea is, if we could look ahead to what our ideal futures would be, what would the message be that we would bring back to educators today? And it's an exercise I do a lot of times in the workshops that I run. And there's another great anecdote behind that, but I'll leave it for the time being for the book. But most of what's in here, as futuristic and fantastic as it sounds, is actually possible today. So the book's more about raising awareness and diffusing innovation than anything else. There's not so much of the impossible and a what if or someday kind of topics in here. This is stuff we can do with our schools today. So it's I've tried to capture a lot of the anecdotes that I share in my sessions and my keynotes and so forth, but it's really supplemented by other experts. So for instance, I'm not a learning space designer, but we hear from David Jakes and from Rebecca Hare and others who are in the Inspiring Spaces chapter. So your participants are really familiar with the honeycomb.
Yeah, so our Teacher Leader 1, every single one of their courses aligned to one of the elements of the honeycomb. And besides, I mean, we didn't really talk about robust infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That wasn't one of the pieces, but every single course was building on those concepts and ideas and building their skills.
Well, let me start with robust infrastructure, actually, because the temptation, of course, is to talk about the stuff, right? Chromebooks or iPads, and how much RAM, and how much bandwidth do you have in the classroom, and that stuff's important, and you want it to be robust from a technical standpoint. Like ideally, every kid's got a device on their desk that never slows them down, and there's never issues with the Wi-Fi, and there's never issues with the bandwidth to the school, and nobody's ever put a backhoe through the fiber out front, right? You want all that to be robust and working, and not transparent in the sense that everybody understands how it works, but transparent in the sense that you don't have to. Like it's you get right to your work, right? You're never distracted by the technology, and that's important. As a side note, I think it is important for teachers, particularly teacher leaders, and anybody that's pursuing a future in the ed tech field per se. It is important to get to learn that. And when I was first a tech coordinator, I was lucky to work with one IT guy in particular, but others too that shared what they knew. And I got my hands dirty and helped re-image machines and helped run cable and set up routers and hack Active Directory so it could work with the Macs at the school, that sort of thing. And I highly recommend that to anybody that's interested. I don't feel like every teacher needs to do that. That would sort of be a waste. Wouldn't necessarily be tied to instructional goals, but if you're interested in this sort of thing and you want to be able to lead in this field and you want to be able to know when somebody on the technical side of the house isn't speaking straight with you, yeah, there's not much replacement for having some of the knowledge yourself. So I actually went and did networking classes with IT professionals and stuff on the weekend, that kind of thing, until I could wrap my head around it. But interestingly, when we pulled together this book, it's not that. It's not talking about Cisco routers and bandwidth and IP protocols and so on. It's talking about other forms of robust infrastructure. So the stuff is not the only infrastructure. We go off on a bit of a tangent in the book around policy infrastructure. So our friend Stephanie Shipton in Hawaii, she worked for the Hawaii Department of Ed for a long time. She runs a nonprofit now. She introduced me to the idea of policy infrastructure, and she looks at it like, if you talk about the way things have always been done, right? The policies oftentimes are a barrier to innovation or doing something new or doing something better. And so she looked at her job as clearing away the barriers for teachers, but also creating the conditions for success, conditions for innovation, and for being able to come up with new things. And a lot of schools they don't have systems in place for that, right? If anything, they've got systems against that. So asking yourselves, like, what can we do at our sites to create, to change the policy infrastructure, right, and create conditions where teachers are going to be able to innovate and try new things with their students, and the students are going to be able to do that too. And if, depending at what level you're looking at, in a very simple way, it's got to be okay to fail and learn from your failures, of course. Teachers have to make it okay for kids to fail in class if they're going to operate outside their comfort zone, and principals have to make it okay for teachers to fail. It's, if they're going to try something new with the devices, and it's got to be okay if it falls flat and it's they lose a period, right? And similarly, anybody that's at the district office or in a coordinator position or whatever, I think also has to make it okay for the principals to fail and for the administrators to fail at a site-wide level, because they're not going to be able to innovate and support the teachers if they don't.
I love, Mark, sorry to interrupt, but I love that you brought that up, just the viewing robust infrastructure in a different way. Mm-hmm. And the last project for the Teacher Leader 2s was doing a 20-time project, and a lot of them were talking about that infrastructure and what needed to change and what their wish would be for changing that infrastructure to create more innovation for teachers, so that's good. We'll have to read more deeply into that chapter for sure.
Yeah, and it spills over into the other elements. It's you certainly could think of culture as being part of the infrastructure of the school, right? Mm-hmm. And so engaging your community is a big part of that. And it spills right into space. One of my favorite examples, that I don't know if it came across any of the materials you guys have been doing, but the Albany Senior High School in outside of Auckland, New Zealand. The first time I went there, I was blown away because I felt like I'd walked into the school that I always, preached about. What if someday, we could, and here it was, which is sort of the idea behind the book, is to share more of those stories. But there they do 20% time it's a public high school, 9-12 essentially, and they do 20% time all day every Wednesday. All kids are working on their impact project or ignite project. And the way it works, the infrastructure they've set in place is each kid gets to pitch a project, and they have to get 3 faculty members to sign off on it. And when the 3 faculty members have signed off on it, now they can get to work, and there's a whole process throughout the year for completing their project or starting a new one. And like, you can actually download all their documents off their website too. So they've literally built an infrastructure for doing 20% time in a school-wide scenario, right? But when it spills over into the space too, they had the opportunity, it's probably 10 years ago now, to redo the space in their school, and they created a high-functioning collaborative workspace on purpose. Like, they went and looked at, they actually worked with architecture firms that worked with companies like Google and Facebook to design the space. So they have, in the space of about 3 or 4 classrooms, it's one room. They're called Learning Commons, and they have, on each level of the building, they've got 2 Learning Commons, and I think probably 8 total, but they each Learning Common is 3 or 4 classrooms wide, and it has 3 or 4 classrooms worth of people in it. But what you realize real quick in that space, because we did too, we ran an event there, the one thing you can't do then is lecture, right? With four lectures going on in the same space. So they had to use their space in more flexible ways, but it's no surprise, I think, that's the school where they were also doing these 20% projects every Wednesday. And evidence of the projects was all over the school too, in terms of, like, kids painted murals, and there's the windmill outside that was the sustainable energy project in the gardens, and the kids wrote software. All the computers on campus, also not coincidentally, were running open source software. So there was a real sense that, speaking of infrastructure, they made the decision that they were going to not use proprietary software like Windows at the time anymore, that they were going to run open source software. So when I got there, all their computers were running, I think it was Ubuntu Linux, right? But the idea, yes, that's infrastructure, and now they're secure and stable and fast, and they cost less. But also, that's the culture that, hey, it's open source. The kids were writing software, and that they felt, that tinkering with the computers was part of their reality. So these pieces all kind of go together, and that's part of, I'm sure you guys have communicated this throughout the program too, but part of the way I see the honeycomb impacting our work is you don't see much change if you focus on one area. Mm-hmm. If you're just focusing on the stuff, or you're just focusing on professional development, in our case, right? Like, you don't see the needle move unless you're also bringing the leadership on board, and you're also engaging the community, and you're also changing the space so that it reflects the the culture of learning that you want to have in your school. So sorry, hopefully that was a good digression off the idea that you hadn't talked about robust infrastructure so much, but.
No, that's great. I would love to hear a little bit just about what advice you would give people around empowered educators, empowering, like what advice you have. I know that you talk a lot about building your PLN, and that's something that we really encourage the teachers to do after the teacher leader cohort. They don't have to tweet all the time what they're learning, but how to encourage them to continue with that professional learning community.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll touch on that, but I'll touch on a couple other things that came to mind when it comes to empowered teachers. But when it comes to building your PLN, hopefully, if you weren't already engaged on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere with other educators, and you're not already reading blogs of other educators, listening to education podcasts, if you're not already doing that, hopefully this program is the leaping off point, right? And it's been interesting to talk to people who maybe were exposed to Twitter or something early on, like a couple of years ago or whatever it might be. Which actually, now that I think about it, it was 11 years ago I got onto Twitter, sort of when it first started hitting education. But so it's not a new thing by any means. But most teachers, of course, are still not necessarily engaged. But some people will be exposed to it at one point, and then it's not till years later where they realize, oh, this is the way to connect with other people and not be alone, right? And not be the the only art teacher on their campus, or the whatever assistant principal that's responsible for discipline, and they're sort of stuck in their hole all day. This is the way to be connected with other kind of innovative and dynamic peers around the world, right? And particularly if you're in a teacher leadership position, oftentimes you are kind of the lone nut on your campus, and being able to connect with others like you through this program or through building your own PLN is important. And that's, in academia, they talk about diffusion of innovation. Suddenly you're the node in your campus, right? And able to bring innovation from elsewhere. And of course, I always like to focus on you sharing what you have, right? I think it was Alec Kuros who said years ago that we have a moral imperative to share as educators. I think especially as public educators. So if you're working on something, if you're even wrestling with a tough problem, you're a third grade teacher, you're likely there's thousands of other teachers out there who are wrestling with the same problem, and even your thoughts about it, even if you don't have solutions, your tough questions are sometimes going to be helpful to others. And if nothing else, you can empathize and commiserate with each other, right? But when it comes to empowered teachers, a couple of other things that come to mind for me that don't always, I think, come to mind when we start thinking of the infrastructure, right, for this is, we at EdTech Team Summits, we always try to make it fun, right? And here in the EdTech Team office and at our retreats, and we always try to make it fun. And for us, Adventure Day is a big deal. And at the events, we've got a photo booth, and we've got contests and this sort of thing. It's like, on one hand, it's kind of a no-brainer, like, oh yeah, we make it fun, so people like it, right? But on the other hand, in teacher speak, we're lowering that affective filter, right? When somebody's taking a silly picture with a silly hat in the photo booth, and they're laughing at each other with their feather boas on, they're going to take themselves a lot less seriously when they get to a really frustrating workshop, or they get into try something new that maybe would have been scary for them. If they've already kind of been laughing at themselves, and it's no big deal if they click the wrong button or they have to ask a stupid question or whatever it is, right? And they're not, by lowering that affective filter, as they say, that emotional filter, they're not as resistant in those situations. And similarly, even if you look at Adventure Day, and it's some of the idea, sometimes when we have the carnival-like activities at the events, or occasionally when we have been able to offer the EdTech Team Adventure after, when people go snowmobiling or whatever it might be, there's this sense of, like, when you climb something or jump off of something or go swimming in something that might be scary, you're sort of practicing that getting out of your comfort zone. If you're doing that with your colleagues, then that's also important. So I think when it comes to empowering teachers, the idea that you want to make it fun, is important. And I think increasingly over time, I think the idea of sort of getting out of the classroom or bringing challenges in, right, and doing something that's physically or emotionally, right, challenging but fun, can be a great way to practice that. The other thing, there's a bit in the book about five elements of effective professional development. And I don't know if I can come up with them all off the top of my head, but there are things like, to me, there's the kindergarten philosophy, which I pulled from my wife, who's a kindergarten teacher, and others, of course, have variations on this. But she used to look at her kids' love of learning bank, right? And for every frustrating time they failed or were shut down, especially, right, or that she yelled at them or whatever, right? That's a $5 withdrawal from the bank, right? And if every time that she praised them or they did well and had success, that's a $1 deposit. So, like, how do you make sure that the deposits outweigh the withdrawals, right? And particularly if you're talking students, but it's, anybody listening to this is going to probably feel the gut feeling that it's true for teachers too. They need to have those small successes, and that's why we focus on a positive hands-on experience, so that they're getting those small successes. We also, I call it the pets and babies philosophy, is the idea that people's kids and dogs are going to teach them more about technology than I ever will. And when, if we're teaching video editing, or we're teaching, I don't know, animation or whatever it might be, or I'm trying to think of some other great examples off the top of my head, but literally anything you can do with technology, make it about their grandkids or about their cat, and all of a sudden the motivation goes way up, and you can leave aside the academic. It doesn't have to be about English literature just yet, for when an English teacher's learning how to edit video, which might be outside his or her skill set, right? But you may suddenly make it about the cat or the grandkid, and they're going to get really into it, and then they're familiar with the tool, and they can turn around and use it in schools, right? I also, another good one in terms of empowering people and helping them manage change initiatives is the idea of, I call it the two turns philosophy, but if you're learning if you're driving a race car, I read a book once called Speed Secrets by this guy named Ross Bentley, right? And he said, when you're driving a race car, you don't look at where you are, right? Like, that would be folly even in an ordinary car. But you also don't look at where you're going, like you might in an ordinary car. When you're driving a race car, you're actually thinking several turns down the road, because the way you go into one turn affects the way you come out of it, affects the way you hit the next turn, affects the way you hit the straightaway, affects your lap times, right? And race car drivers actually will walk the track, and then they'll drive the track slow and find their line. We don't have that kind of luxury as a general rule in education, but the idea of trying to think two turns down the road, or 2 months or 2 years, where do you want your practice to be? If you come to a summit or read a book or take a teacher leader certificate, you don't have to be overwhelmed in trying to do it all right away. But you can look to where do you want your practice to be in 2 years, or whatever the case might be, and start going into these turns now, so that you come out of them where you want to be, right? And I think that's a lot of times in the work we do with Ed Tech team, it's like the fire hose of learning, and it can be overwhelming. And what's the metaphor a lot of our presenters use is the buffet, right? It's more like it's there's always something there if you if you want something. You don't worry about eating all the buffet. Or swimming in a river, you don't worry about swimming in all the water, but whenever you want to go swimming, there's going to be some there for you. And I think, speaking of PLN, that goes to PLN too. You don't want to read all the Twitter, but and you don't want to worry about what you missed last night. But whenever you're ready to dip your toe in, it's going to be there.
Yeah, that is really good advice, because I know that 12 weeks of learning, being connected in a cohort, thinking starting a new school year, I want to start and do everything. It will be very overwhelming, but taking little bits here and there, and as you're ready to do more and more in your classroom, that would be awesome. Mark, I'd love to have you share one more area, and I'll let you maybe be the one to choose if you want to talk about student agency, maybe, or
that's great. Yeah, it's hard to choose, right?
And just
I
leave us
think,
with overall.
I think student agency is certainly the heart of it. So I'm going to try to bring it home there. But another story does occur to me from the courageous leadership, and I didn't really talk about courageous leadership. And I think since this is a teacher leader cohort, this is probably a good place to go with it. And you won't necessarily be in a place of formal leadership, but this story about formal leadership might be inspiring. There's a guy named Ben Gray who's certainly got a reputation in ed tech circles, and he's an assistant superintendent in Illinois. And several years ago, when his district was going 1-to-1, I believe they're now 2-to-1 with laptops and tablets. Essentially, they there was a lot of fear from the teachers around the possibility that they might be evaluated based on their implementation of the new technology. And in order to alleviate that fear, the Ben and the leadership there actually eliminated teacher evaluations, suspended teacher evaluations for 2 years, just took that off the table. And so for 2 years, while they learned this new way of doing business in a 1-to-1 classroom, they weren't concerned about the implications on their formal evaluations, right? Obviously, the leaders are still in the classroom, helping the teachers and so on. And there was, I'm sure there's a good deal of coaching happening to make that program a success. But the idea that they could take something seemingly immutable like teacher evaluations and remove that in the service of the innovation that they were trying to make happen, I think is certainly an example of courageous leadership, but also an example of like just how much we can remove the blinders of our existing systems and do things differently going forward. And I think in terms of bringing it home to student agency, almost everything we've said today in terms of, and I hinted at it at one point, you got to make it okay for the students to fail, right? But everything we've said today about lowering the affective filter and making it fun, giving opportunities for failure and making that okay, and setting up a space that is reflective of the culture you want in the classroom. Like all of that really is focused on students too. To any degree that we're trying to empower teachers, you can take almost all of that and roll that back to empowering students, because you want to ensure that students are the ones that are making, creating, doing, editing, publishing, collaborating, and ultimately doing the heavy lifting, as they like to say. Trying to think if there's a good, well, I can sort of leave a teaser, I guess, of something you can learn more about in the book. But another friend from Hawaii, Brendan Brennan, runs the Moonshot Laboratory, where they basically engage kids in the same way that scientists and engineers are engaged at Google's X Lab, where they look in that intersection of hard to solve problems and innovative solutions and breakthrough technology. And sometimes, teachers and students may not necessarily be creating new devices or technologies or whatever, but they may be writing software or finding somebody who could. And the kids at the Moonshot Laboratory, who are from different neighboring schools, actually are solving real world problems with the resources available to them from their schools and from the Moonshot Laboratory. And that's a model that the laboratory and Brennan have been able to spread elsewhere. I mean, we're doing a couple of them here in California this coming year, this new year. And it's something that I think can be inspiring to others too, is that kids don't have to be turning in papers and twiddling their thumbs, waiting for feedback for the next, for 18 or whatever, 12 years of school. That's a lot of man hours wasted that they ought to be engaged with the community, right? And solving real problems in their world. So, asking yourselves what problems you want to solve at your schools is a great place to start as a teacher leader. But turn around and ask the kids too what problems they want to solve in their community. And I am often sort of floored and sobered by kids' answers and aspirations. So I think asking kids, what do you want to solve, or even a question I've loved for years is, what do you want to learn? You've got me and all the resources of the school at your disposal. What do you want to learn? What problems do you want to solve? I think is a great place to start for student agency.
Yeah, that's very awesome. It made me think of one of the phrases that definitely stuck with me from the beginning of the book was you were just asking the question of letting people think about what is possible today and what is your own vision for the future, and letting the students think that too. So what is their vision for their future in education, and have the educators ask that too. So Mark, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. I know that everyone in the teacher leader cohort is probably excited to dive in a little bit deeper and learn a little bit more about all these elements and hear from all the different voices that you brought in your book, which is so great.
Yeah, it's about 24 other innovative educators in there. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's awesome. Dominique, are there any questions that we want to share, or do we can answer them on Twitter as well?
Yeah, we had a couple questions come in through YouTube or through the webinar room. And just, Mark, how would you recommend, as a diverse educator, moving forward with some of these concepts for student change and empowering, or maybe some of the leadership change? Do you have any advice?
Oh boy. I'm hearing maybe two different things when I hear a diverse educator, right? So perhaps this is an educator of color who submitted this, and they I think sometimes have an experience where it's more difficult for them to be heard. So that could be what this question is about. But there's another layer also that I think is everybody's concern, which is our kids feel that way too, right? Or they feel like this isn't for them, whether that's school or technology, right? And that's a different story. Is how do we make people of all different backgrounds feel comfortable, in our schools and even with technology, and that could be girls in technology, that could be immigrants. There's a lot of dimensions you could look at this at. There's certainly no easy answers. In terms of being heard, and I think this, I can't speak with any street cred. It's not like I went through my career as an educator of color who may have been dismissed at times, but I've certainly seen enough of it to know that keeping going is critical, right? And reaching out to more people is critical. Connecting to those communities of others who might be in a similar situation is critical, and that's again where your PLN might come into play. Even at the outskirts of it, I've learned a lot from our team's efforts over the last couple of years with the Our Voice Academy and some of the programs that preceded it, where there's tremendous communities of innovative and kiki and dynamic educators of color who are really well connected with each other and with others, and seeking those out can, I know, be a real source of support. And increasingly, school leaders are coming out of those communities too. I was looking recently at the demographics of students and teachers in the United States, and I'm not going to be able to remember exact numbers off the top of my head, but students of color is well over 50%, across the U.S. and in some places, obviously, that's much higher. But teachers of color is much lower. It's considerably lower. Again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's in some places it's a lot. It's like 10%, right, in aggregate. And if you look at leadership positions or technology positions, that number goes down even further. So there's a real need for people who are in a place to do something about it, to step up and particularly teacher leaders. A lot of teacher leaders are going to be the future formal leaders, right? School leaders, administrators, proprietors of new businesses and executive directors of new nonprofits. And having done this now, not that I'm a veteran, but having done this now for as long as I have, I've seen so many people come up through that process that I think sort of encouraging people to keep going is probably the best I can do. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for that. It's something I think we are as a field in education. That's something that we have to do better at, and doubly so in education technology. So, if there's people asking that question in this cohort or watching this video, they're probably in a even better place to do something about it than somebody like you or I. But reach out. I'd be happy to chat too.
Awesome.
Was there another one, Dominique? I don't know what our time constraints are.
We're probably at the end. So if you don't mind, Mark, if people can tweet out any other questions that they have and add you to them. Unless, Dominique, was there anything else that was pressing? Okay. But we really, really appreciate it and are just so thankful for your whole model of school change, because it's definitely been such a great guide for the teacher leader cohort, and really helping them to understand what they can do and how they can become a leader in their school and make education better for every single student who walks in through their doors.
Yeah, I'm easy to find on Twitter. It's just @Mark Wagner.
Perfect. So use the EdTech Team Online hashtag and @Mark Wagner to ask your questions, and he can get back to you. And once again, teacher leaders, congratulations. We're very proud of you, and thanks for all your hard work in this. And Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share more about More Now.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Dominique.
You know the background behind the title. All right, thank you. Bye. Everyone.